Good day. It is with great pleasure that I am joining you at the IGE Shinhan Bank Seoul International Finance Conference. I'm sending you this video because unfortunately I'm unable to join you in person for the panel on sustainability. I want to talk about the pursuit of sustainability and its intersection with geopolitics. We are right now in what many people consider to be a geopolitical recession, that so many of the more positive trends that have marked the last 70 years, but particularly the last 30 years in the international system, are now fraying or moving in the opposite direction. We are in the midst of several transitions, and one transition is deeply interwoven with the other transitions. And that transition is, of course, the one related to sustainability, the transition away from fossil fuels or carbon-heavy energy to a more sustainable global energy system. Now, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the geopolitical trends that are happening and describe what I like to call a vicious or pernicious cycle, where we have a negative geopolitical trend that's interacting with the force of the energy transition, the move towards renewable energy in a way that is counterproductive. So this negative spiral has this geopolitical trend interacting with the energy transition, and the net result is that the geopolitical trend is deepening and the energy transition is being slowed down. I'll give you 3 examples of where I see this is the case, and just close by saying, with a little bit of hope and optimism, that this cycle or these cycles don't have to be inevitable, that there is some prospect that wise policymakers can reverse this negative cycle. So first, I would say one of the most significant geopolitical transitions taking place is the move away from international cooperation towards great power rivalry. You'll all be well aware that we're living in an era that maybe just 5 or 10 years ago, it was almost inconceivable that we could have a war between great powers. And now, today in 2024, it is very conceivable. In fact, it is something that policymakers around the world worry about in a very real sense every day. The possibility of a conflict between the United States and China is possible. And certainly the conflict or a conflict between Russia and the United States is conceivable. And in fact, many people feel that there is some sort of proxy conflict going on in the war in Ukraine, which is a war, of course, of Europe against Russia. So how is this great power rivalry interacting with the energy transition? I'd say the first and most obvious piece is this great power rivalry is making it harder to get the international cooperation that is necessary to deal with what is obviously a global problem. And that is the problem of global emissions. That in an ideal world, if there is a problem that transcends national boundaries, it would obviously be best addressed through the use of cooperative mechanisms and through institutions that cross boundaries like the United Nations. While there still is a global effort through the Conference of the Parties mechanism, institutions like the UN are increasingly hobbled by the fact that the United States, Russia, and China, the 3 of the 5 veto members of the United Nations, are deeply contested and in the process of competing across a variety of domains. We also, again, see the reverse, that the energy transition itself is exacerbating great power rivalry. And that is because this energy transition is anything but smooth and well synchronized. Instead, we see a jagged transition that is happening in a way where supply of energy and demand for energy are not that well coordinated. And the result is that, as we have seen right around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that traditional suppliers of oil and gas actually can benefit by this discordant and this unsynchronized changes in supply and demand. In fact, right before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you had an energy crisis going on in Europe that gave Putin a lot of leverage economically at the same time that he was looking to change the geopolitical chessboard. Another second transition that is interacting with the energy transition is the global move from an integrated global economy to a more fragmented global economy. If you think just decades ago, at any given time, there were about 1 to 2% of supply chains that were moving across national boundaries. It was a relatively stable time and one where businesses and companies were really prioritizing efficiency. We're clearly in a different geopolitical landscape now, where fragmentation is the dominant theme, and you have anywhere between 25 and 30% of supply chains shifting at any given moment. So how is this trend from integration to fragmentation interacting with the energy transition? First, we can see that this fragmentation, this movement of supply chains, is making the energy transition more costly, and it's slowing it down. If you think about a perfect world, one absent of geopolitics, if China were to make and dominate clean energy supply chains and be able to make clean energy materials and inputs cheaper and more plentifully and faster than anyone else, then that would simply be a benefit to the global economy. But in this geopolitical environment, it's anything but that. It is a source of insecurity. And as a result, we see efforts on the part of anywhere from India, Korea, Japan, the United States, trying to recreate or duplicate clean energy supply chains, again, making the energy transition slower and more costly. And of course, there's also the reverse, as I suggested. How is the energy transition influencing fragmentation? And I would say there are definitely pressures associated with the energy transition that are reinforcing the ways, the movement towards self-sufficiency. If we think about a world that does have a cleaner energy backbone, it is a world that is highly electrified, much more electrified than the world we live in today. And as a result, that electrification is much more likely, the energy source powering that electrification is much more likely to be found within a single country's national boundaries, not exclusively, but much more likely. And as a result, a lot of the energy trade that is characterizing global trade today will be less necessary. That's trade in oil and gas. And instead, again, we'll see countries supplying their own energy, breaking down some very important geopolitical and geoeconomic ties between countries. So let me just give one more example of a global trend that is occurring on the geopolitical landscape and how it is interacting with the energy transition. And that is the global trend of, I like to call it, convergence to divergence. The convergence is essentially that for many decades, there was a movement where as the developed world, the OECD economies got more wealthy, so did the economies of the global South or the developing world. That although there were huge gaps between these two very broad categories of countries and their economies, that what was good for one economy was also good for the other economy. And now we're seeing a real divergence there. The combination of COVID and the disparity in vaccination rates, the debt crisis that is occurring, the energy crisis, food crises, all of these things are making life more difficult for many emerging economies and particularly developing economies in the global South. And we can see the resentment that is being directed towards the West and more developed countries on the part of the global South. Now, how is the energy transition reinforcing this, or climate change reinforcing this move from convergence to divergence? A lot of it is quite self-evident. You have the countries in the world that are suffering the most from the effects of climate change and are under the greatest pressures to address some aspects of the energy transition and to develop their economies in a way that is more economically, or sorry, more ecologically friendly, these are the countries that are not responsible for putting so many of the carbon emissions into the global atmosphere. And from leaders from Africa, Latin America, to other parts of Asia, we hear the very legitimate frustration that these countries feel about being the victims of climate change without having the responsibility for stoking climate change, yet at the same time being under pressure to develop in a way that might be more difficult or more costly than other countries developed earlier in their histories. Now, again, there's also the flip side of this, that you have the energy transition, or the divergence rather, of the developed world from the developing world is making it harder to have the energy transition be successful on the timescale that is necessary for the world to address climate change in the way that climate scientists and activists and other citizens are eager to see it happen. And that is because so many of the emissions that need to be mitigated over the next 2.5 decades are emissions that come from the developing world. And so without the support and the success of the developing world, and being both able to meet energy demand and to secure prosperity for its citizens, while doing this without exacerbating the carbon emissions problem, there's no prospect that the world as a whole will be able to address the problem. But as I said at the start of this video, this is not inevitable. This cycle that I'm describing, where geopolitics and the energy transition are interacting in a negative way, is not irreversible. And it is not even necessary, as some might think, for the geopolitical landscape to be that much more improved for us to make progress in the energy transition. What is required is for the world and for policymakers in Asia and the United States, Europe, Africa, and elsewhere to think differently about the energy transition. Right now, policymakers are very focused on the idea that the energy transition or sustainability is a goal. It's a place we need to travel to. And it might be a very expensive journey, a difficult journey, but it is an end. It is an objective. Instead, let's start thinking about the energy transition as also a means, as a tool for addressing the geopolitical problems we see, rather than as actions that will only exacerbate our geopolitical ills. So what I mean by that is that wise policymakers will be able to think about the energy transition and how to advance the energy transition in a way that can address the fragmentation that is happening, the disconnect between the global South and the developed world, and can address great power rivalry. There are many examples I could give of this, but I will be brief and just give you two very quick examples. So first, part of the whole fragmentation trend is this move away from free trade that we see in so many places, including my own country, the United States. And what happens here is that we could see the need to diversify supply chains, to do friendshoring, to secure our new energy future by the need to ensure greater market access by many countries into the United States and Europe and elsewhere. So the energy transition is a reason for tackling the question of free trade agreements once more, and not from shying away from the hard politics of it. If we're going to make a successful energy transition, there will need to be more trade with more partners around the world. Secondly, we can think about the whole prospect of green growth differently. We're all well aware that in order for there to be a successful energy transition, there needs to be a lot of new finance mechanisms provided to the global South. But we need to think about not just the politics around a big transfer of wealth from developed countries to the global South. Instead, we need to think about how can we make investments in the global South where they can be integral parts of the overall supply chain for the energy transition, that the parts of the global South that have comparative advantages, how can they be encouraged to be key partners and key suppliers of the energy transition to the rest of the world. It'll be steps like that that will not only advance the energy transition, but will also address the geopolitical challenges of our time. With that, I wish an excellent conference for you and a wonderful panel with many people that I hope to meet in the future. Thank you.